The salt-scented wind hit me the moment I stepped out of the car, a sharp slap that carried the tang of the ocean. The town of Ravens Cove stretched before me, a collection of weathered houses and narrow streets clinging to the rocky cliffs. The waves crashed endlessly against jagged rocks below, as though the sea itself was trying to reclaim the land. I stood there, gripping the door of my car, taking in the town that was supposed to give me a new start. My reflection stared back at me in the window, pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, scars that twisted from my left cheekbone down to my jaw, a permanent reminder of what had happened, a reminder that no amount of distance or fresh air could erase. A gust of wind sent a shiver through me. I pulled my coat tighter and took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. It was time to stop running from the past. This was my reset button. I was here to heal, to build something new, and maybe, just maybe, to feel human again. The old Victorian house I'd rented sat at the edge of the cliff, its paint peeling, the shutters creaking in the breeze. The realtor had called it quaint, but there was something melancholic about it, like the house was holding on to secrets, just like me. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The door groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The air was cold, stale. Sunlight filtered through the salt-streaked windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. The place smelled of damp wood and forgotten memories. I set my bags down in the hallway and glanced around. The furniture was sparse. A worn-out couch, a coffee table with rings from long-dried cups, curtains that fluttered like ghosts. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the distant roar of the waves below. I moved to the window, my eyes drawn to the horizon. The ocean stretched out, endless and unforgiving. The sky was bruised with clouds, the threat of a storm lingering at the edges. The wind picked up, and for a moment I thought I heard something else beneath the whistle of the breeze, a low guttural sound that curled in my gut. I shook it off. Imagination, I told myself. Just the aftershocks of the trauma. The doctors had warned me about this. Hyper-awareness, phantom sounds, irrational fears. My mind was still healing, even if my body wasn't. A sharp pain lanced through my side, sudden and brutal. I sucked in a breath, my hand flying to my ribs. The scars there felt hot, throbbing in time with my heartbeat. I leaned against the windowsill, closing my eyes, willing the pain to pass. It always did. Eventually. After a moment, the ache dulled to a steady throb, the fire fading to embers. I exhaled slowly, opening my eyes. The ocean was still there, the waves still crashing, indifferent to my suffering. I needed to distract myself, to do something before the walls closed in on me. Unpacking could wait. A walk might help clear my head. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind me. The streets of Ravens Cove were quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but watchful. Eyes peered out from behind curtains. Faces turned away when I looked too closely. I knew what they saw. A stranger, someone who didn't belong. The scars probably didn't help. I walked down to the shoreline, where the sand was damp and dark, littered with fragments of shells and seaweed. The wind whipped through my hair, carrying with it the scent of brine and decay. I focused on the rhythm of the waves, the crash and retreat, trying to match my breathing to it. In, out, in, out. It almost worked. Then I felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the empty beach, the cliffs rising on either side like silent sentinels. Nothing, just rocks, waves, and the endless gray sky. But the feeling didn't fade. It coiled tighter, a knot of unease in my stomach. I shook my head and kept walking, my footsteps crunching in the wet sand. You're imagining things. That's what I told myself. That's what I needed to believe. A figure appeared in the distance, standing at the water's edge. A woman, her dark hair whipping around her face, her coat flaring out behind her. She stared out at the horizon, unmoving, like a statue carved from the mist. Something about her presence steadied me. Maybe it was the stillness she exuded, a calm defiance against the relentless wind. I walked closer, the weight in my chest easing slightly. As if sensing me, she turned. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, sharp and clear, like sea glass. A faint smile curved her lips, but there was something guarded in her expression, a flicker of recognition that I didn't understand. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice low and calm. I glanced at the churning waves, at the sky that seemed ready to shatter. I suppose that's one word for it. She laughed softly, the sound carried away by the wind. "You must be Victor, the doctor who moved into the old Ashford place. I nodded, surprised. Word travels fast. It's a small town, she said with a shrug. I'm Emily. I teach at the high school. Nice to meet you, Emily. The words felt strange on my tongue, too formal, too normal for a man who felt anything but normal. She studied me for a moment, her gaze lingering on the scar along my jaw. I waited for the awkward question, the pitying look, but it never came. Instead, she said, "We all carry scars." Her words hung between us, unexpected and raw. I didn't know how to respond. Before I could, she turned back to the waves. "See you around, Victor." She walked away, her figure fading into the mist, leaving me alone with the wind and the relentless sea. I stood there for a long time, the cold sinking into my bones. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. But that night, as the moon rose and the pain returned, sharper and deeper than before, I realized something else. Whatever was inside me wasn't alone either. It was waking up. The pain was a living thing, coiled deep inside me. It twisted through my ribs, my muscles locking up as I clutched the edge of the bathroom sink. My reflection stared back at me, distorted by the condensation on the mirror. My eyes were wild, bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them deeper than before. Sweat rolled down my temples despite the chill in the air. I'd thought I knew pain. The attack that left me scarred had been excruciating, a violence that shredded flesh and fractured bone. But this was different. This was primal, like my body was fighting itself, piece by piece. A guttural groan escaped me as another wave hit, my vision blackening at the edges. I gripped the sink tighter, my knuckles white, nails digging into porcelain. My heartbeat thumped in my ears, a frantic animal rhythm that didn't feel like mine. Through the window, the full moon hung heavy in the night sky, a pale and unfeeling eye. Its light poured into the room, coating everything in silver. My skin prickled, my senses sharpening to a razor's edge. I could hear the distant crash of the waves, the rustle of leaves, the scuttle of something small moving outside. And beneath it all, a hunger gnawed at me. A craving I didn't understand, something raw and urgent. I gasped, my breath ragged. The moonlight seemed to intensify, searing through my skin. My bones ached, stretching and grinding as if they were no longer content to stay where they were. The reflection in the mirror shimmered, my face blurring for a moment, then sharpening again. The eyes looking back at me weren't mine. They were yellow, vivid, feral, and filled with a thirst that clenched my gut. "No," I choked out. "This isn't real. This can't be real." I stumbled away from the sink, crashing into the wall, my shoulder scraping against the cracked plaster. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in, suffocating me. My vision swam as I staggered to the window, throwing it open. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and salty, but it wasn't enough. My skin burned, my blood boiling beneath the surface. I needed to get out, to escape this cage of walls and mirrors. My body moved on instinct, driven by some deep foreign urge. I barely felt my feet hit the ground as I vaulted over the porch railing and landed on the frost-covered grass. The wind howled through the cliffs, the ocean roaring below. The ground was damp, the earth alive under my fingertips. I dropped to my knees, my fingers clawing at the dirt, my breathing ragged and desperate. My senses were on fire, every scent, every sound, sharp enough to cut me. A sound rose from deep within my chest, a low, vibrating growl. The world narrowed to moonlight and darkness, to the pulse of blood and the scent of salt. Somewhere in the haze of pain and confusion, a voice cut through. "Victor!" I jerked my head up, my vision blurring with tears. Emily stood a few yards away, her face pale in the moonlight. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a split second, fear flickered across her features. But she didn't move, didn't run. "What are you doing here?" I choked out, my voice warped, barely recognizable. "I saw you from the path," she said, her voice low, careful. "You looked wrong." A bolt of shame shot through me, sharp enough to pierce the haze. I was on all fours, dirt under my fingernails, my breath coming in guttural snarls. I felt like an animal, barely restrained, just a thread away from snapping. I didn't want her to see me like this. No one should see me like this. "You shouldn't be here," I rasped. "Please go." Her eyes locked onto mine, searching. "You need help. You can't help me." The words tore from me like glass. "No one can." I turned away, the pain building again, the change clawing at the edges of my mind. I felt my muscles twitch, my fingers curling involuntarily into the earth. My vision doubled, then tripled. My jaw ached, as if it were about to unhinge. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, to just let me be me for one more minute. A hand touched my shoulder, warm, steady. "Victor," Emily whispered, "look at me." I forced my eyes open. Her face swam into focus, calm, determined. There was no fear in her eyes now, only something that looked dangerously close to understanding. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Whatever this is, we can figure it out." A sob caught in my throat. The hunger, the rage, they were still there, simmering just beneath the surface. But her words were like a tether, anchoring me to the ground, to reality. I took a shaky breath. My heart slowed, the burning under my skin easing slightly. The world tilted back into place, the sharpness of my senses fading. I was still here, still me. For now. Emily's hand slid away and she stepped back, giving me space. I pushed myself upright, my legs trembling. I felt hollowed out, every inch of me raw and fragile. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I saw something flicker there. Hesitation, doubt, as if she wanted to say something else, something important, but she didn't. "Let's get you inside," she said instead, her voice gentle. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We walked back to the house in silence, her presence steady beside me. The pain had faded, but the dread remained, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The hunger, the rage, and they were growing stronger. And next time, I might not be able to pull myself back. Next time, I might lose the fight completely. The house was suffocatingly silent. Emily guided me through the door, her hand a steady weight on my shoulder. My body felt like a hollow shell, every nerve raw and exposed. The floorboards creaked under our steps, the sound echoing like a warning. I sank onto the worn-out couch, my head dropping into my hands. The change had ebbed away for now, but I could feel it, lurking beneath my skin like a snake coiled to strike. Every heartbeat felt borrowed, fragile. I didn't know how much longer I could fight it. Emily paced in front of me, her footsteps light and deliberate. Her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes betrayed her, a storm of conflict brewing behind the calm surface. "I need answers, Victor," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but there was steel behind it. "What's happening to you?" I hesitated, shame clawing at me. I'd tried so hard to hide it, to lock the monster away behind closed doors and clenched teeth, but the walls were breaking and the truth was seeping through the cracks. "I was attacked," I whispered. The words scraped against my throat. "Months ago, a creature. I thought it was a wild animal. I woke up covered in blood, barely alive." Emily stopped pacing. Her gaze sharpened. "Where did this happen?" "Portland," I replied. "In an alley behind the hospital. I'd just finished a long shift. I didn't see it coming." Her jaw tightened and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe regret. "And now," I continued, my voice hollow, "something's inside me, changing me. Every full moon, it gets worse. I lose control. I can feel it clawing its way out, and I don't know how to stop it." Silence stretched between us. I looked up, meeting her eyes. "You should leave, Emily, before it's too late." But she didn't move. Instead, she sank into the chair across from me, her expression unreadable. "I knew there was something about you," she said, her voice low. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the arms of the chair. "I didn't come to Raven's Cove by accident, Victor. I was sent here. I'm a hunter." The room spun. Her words slammed into me, each one a nail pinning me to the floor. "A hunter," I whispered. "You mean—" "A werewolf hunter," she finished. Her eyes didn't waver. "I've been tracking the attacks, following the pattern. I was sent here to find you, to end this." My heart pounded, a desperate, irregular rhythm. Betrayal, fear, and anger churned inside me. I shot to my feet, stumbling back a step. So this was all a lie? Us meeting, you helping me. It was just part of your plan? No. She stood too, her eyes pleading. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know it was you at first. And then, I got to know you. I saw the man you are, not the monster you're becoming." I shook my head, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. "So what now? Are you going to kill me?" She closed her eyes briefly, pain flickering across her face. "I don't want to. I think there might be a way to break the curse, but it's dangerous." "Dangerous?" I laughed bitterly. "More dangerous than turning into a monster and ripping people apart?" She didn't smile. "There's an ancient ritual. It can purge the curse, but it comes at a price." I swallowed hard, dread curling in my stomach. "What price?" Her eyes glistened. "The ritual requires a sacrifice. Someone you love." The words hung in the air, a guillotine poised to drop. A bitter laugh escaped me. Well, that solves the problem, doesn't it? I don't love anyone. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. My eyes met hers, and the truth lay between us, unspoken and undeniable. I loved her. The realization was a blade to the heart. She took a shaky breath, tears threatening to spill. There has to be another way. There isn't, I whispered. We both know it. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. The full moon's glow pressed against the glass, a silent reminder that time was running out. The change was coming again, and this time, I didn't know if I'd survive it, or if anyone else would. I looked at Emily, her face pale and resolute. The weight of our choices bore down on us. We were trapped between the monster I was becoming and the sacrifice needed to stop it. I can't let you do this, I said, my voice trembling. You deserve to live. She stepped closer, her hand brushing my cheek, the touch so gentle it broke me. And you deserve to be free. Tears burned my eyes. I don't want to lose you. Her smile was bittersweet. You won't. Whatever happens, I'll be with you. A surge of pain racked my body, my knees buckling. The monster roared inside me, fighting to be free. I clutched her hand, my vision blurring. The moon's light was blinding now, searing through my skin. Do it, I gasped, before it's too late. Emily's face twisted with grief, but she nodded. She pressed a kiss to my forehead, a whisper of warmth against the cold. I love you, she said. Her words were the last thing I heard before the darkness took me, the monster's roar fading into silence. When I woke, the first rays of dawn were spilling through the windows. The pain was gone, the hunger silent. I lifted a trembling hand to my chest, my heart beating steadily beneath it. I was free, but the emptiness beside me told me the price had been paid. I walked to the window, the sun rising over the ocean, waves crashing against the cliffs. A new day, a new beginning, but one I would walk alone. Her sacrifice had saved me, and now I would live for both of us, always. The town of Willow Creek had always been a haven of tranquility, nestled amidst the dense forests of Oregon. Its residents cherished the simplicity of their lives, where everyone knew each other, and the days flowed with predictable ease. But that fragile peace was shattered when the first body was discovered. I had returned to Willow Creek seeking solace from the chaos of Portland, hoping to rebuild my life and practice in the comforting familiarity of my hometown. As a child psychologist, I believed I had encountered the depths of human trauma. Yet, nothing prepared me for the horror that unfolded. The victims were found in the most gruesome states, bodies torn apart as if by some savage beast. The brutality was unlike anything the local authorities had ever seen. Fear seeped into the community, turning neighbors into wary strangers. The once vibrant streets emptied as dusk approached, and whispers of a lurking evil grew louder. In the midst of this terror, a young boy named Danny was found wandering near the edge of the forest, silent and visibly shaken. At 8 years old, his wide eyes reflected a depth of fear that spoke volumes. The authorities brought him to me, hoping I could unravel the mystery locked within his traumatized mind. Danny's silence was profound. He refused to speak, his small frame trembling at the slightest sound, but his hands were never idle. He drew incessantly, filling pages with dark, haunting images, wolves with gleaming eyes, shadowy figures beneath a full moon, and scenes of blood and chaos. Each drawing was a window into his nightmares, and perhaps a clue to the horrors that plagued our town. As I delved deeper into Danny's psyche, I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't mere products of a child's imagination. There was a chilling realism to his art that suggested he had witnessed something unimaginable. The connection between his drawings and the recent murders became an obsession for me. I needed to understand what Danny had seen, not only to help him, but to protect our community from further bloodshed. Late one evening, as I pored over Danny's latest depiction, a grotesque scene of a ritual beneath the moonlight, I felt a presence outside my window. The hairs on my neck stood on end as a low, mournful howl echoed from the forest's depths. It was a sound that resonated with ancient fear, stirring something primal within me. Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching local legends and folklore. I discovered whispers of an old pagan cult that once thrived in these woods, performing rituals to summon dark forces in exchange for power. The more I uncovered, the more Danny's drawings made a sinister kind of sense. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was too horrifying to accept. As the next full moon approached, a sense of impending doom settled over Willow Creek. I knew that whatever haunted our town was far from finished, and Danny was at the heart of it. I had to act swiftly. The safety of an innocent child and the soul of our community depended on unraveling the dark secrets that lay hidden in the shadows. Little did I know, the true horror was yet to reveal itself, lurking closer than I could ever imagine. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. My office window rattled slightly, and I rubbed my eyes, trying to dismiss the gnawing sense of unease that had crept into my bones. Danny's drawing lay on my desk, the charcoal lines seeming to writhe under the dim desk lamp. The ritual beneath the moonlight, cloaked figures, clawed hands reaching up to the sky, and those piercing eyes gleaming from the shadows. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of the wood barely audible over the storm outside. Something was watching us. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. A sudden noise made me jump, a scratching sound at the window. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly I turned my head, my heart pounding in my chest. A branch, gnarled and leafless, scraped rhythmically against the glass. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. I tried to focus. My eyes returned to Danny, who sat quietly in the corner of the room, his small hands clutching a worn stuffed bear. The boy hadn't spoken a word in days. His gaze was fixed on the window, eyes wide and unblinking, his body rigid with fear. "Danny?" I whispered, my voice low and gentle. "It's okay. You're safe here." He didn't respond. Instead, he began to hum softly, a broken and disjointed melody that raised the hair on my arms. I swallowed hard. The tune was strangely familiar, an old nursery rhyme, twisted somehow into something darker. His fingers tightened around the bear until his knuckles turned white. "Danny," I said again, kneeling in front of him. "Please, can you tell me what you saw in the forest?" He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the window. Then, in a voice so low I almost missed it, he whispered, "The wolf watches." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the window again, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the night and the restless wind. I turned back to Danny, but his attention had shifted. He was drawing again, his hand moving in frantic strokes across the paper. I hesitated, dread curling in my stomach. Then, slowly, I looked down at the picture. The drawing showed a woman standing in front of a window. My window. And behind her, a pair of monstrous eyes gleamed from the darkness. A cold wave of terror washed over me. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the wooden floor. My mind raced, logic struggling to keep up with the primal fear clawing at my sanity. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow in the stillness of the room. "Danny, it's just a drawing," I said, more to convince myself than him. But Danny didn't answer. He just kept drawing, the sound of charcoal scratching against paper filling the silence. Outside, the wind died suddenly, leaving a heavy, unnatural stillness in its wake. A knock at the door shattered the quiet. I nearly screamed. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun to face the door. It was late, too late for visitors. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob. "Laura?" a familiar voice called. "It's Sam." Relief surged through me. I exhaled a shaky breath and opened the door to find Sheriff Keller standing there, his face lined with exhaustion. His eyes flickered with concern as he took in my pale face and the shaking boy behind me. "Everything okay?" he asked, stepping inside. I nodded, though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. "Danny." He said something strange, and his drawings. "They're getting worse." Sam looked over at the boy, his jaw tightening. "Another body was found tonight," he said quietly. "Same as the others." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Where?" He hesitated. "Near the old Miller property." I froze. The Millers, Danny's family. The connection sent a wave of nausea through me. Sam took a deep breath, his eyes weary. "Laura, we need to figure out what's going on before the whole town tears itself apart. People are scared, and scared people do stupid things." I nodded. I knew he was right. The air in Willow Creek was thick with fear and suspicion. We were running out of time. Sam glanced at Danny, his face softening. Has he said anything useful? I hesitated. He said, the wolf watches. Sam's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? I don't know. But even as I said it, a horrifying suspicion bloomed in my mind. We needed answers. And I feared that whatever Danny had witnessed in the forest, whatever was tearing people apart, wasn't just some wild animal. It was something much worse, and it was watching us. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on me, but fear kept my mind razor sharp. Sam and I exchanged a grim look as Danny sat motionless in the corner, his latest drawing clenched in his small fist. The image haunted me. My silhouette at the window, monstrous eyes gleaming just behind me. A silent watcher, a predator lurking in the dark. We can't stay here, I whispered to Sam. It knows where we are. He nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. We need to get Danny somewhere safe, somewhere away from the forest. A low growl vibrated through the air, barely audible, like a warning whispered on the wind. My heart slammed against my ribs. Sam's hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip. Now, he said, his voice tight. We need to go now. I scooped Danny into my arms. He didn't resist, his body stiff and cold as if he'd already surrendered to whatever nightmare hunted us. Sam led the way, checking the hallway before signaling me to follow. Each step felt like trudging through quicksand. Every creak of the floorboards a flare of terror. We reached the front door. Sam slowly turned the knob, his movements careful and deliberate. The door swung open onto the cold, moonlit night. The forest loomed ahead, the shadows between the trees impossibly deep. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the scent of pine and decay. I tightened my grip on Danny. His eyes remained open but vacant, as if he'd retreated deep inside himself. Sam stepped outside, his gaze scanning the yard. The air was still, too still. Then, the silence shattered. A snarl erupted from the darkness. A figure lunged from the shadows, a blur of fur, teeth, and gleaming eyes. Sam fired his gun, the crack of the shot tearing through the night. The creature recoiled, a pained growl escaping its throat as it disappeared back into the trees. Go! Sam yelled. We ran. Branches clawed at my arms and face as I stumbled through the underbrush, Danny's weight heavy in my arms. The moon's cold light barely penetrated the dense canopy. Behind us, I heard Sam's boots pounding the earth, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then a sickening thud, a strangled cry. I stopped and turned, my heart lodged in my throat. Sam lay crumpled on the ground, his gun just out of reach. Above him, the creature loomed, its form half shadow, half nightmare. Blood dripped from its jaws, its eyes burning with a terrifying intelligence. It was no mere beast. It was a man, twisted, transformed, trapped in a monstrous form. And I recognized those eyes. Richard, I breathed. The creature's snarl faltered, as if my voice had tugged at a memory buried deep beneath the curse. For a fleeting second, Richard's face emerged, weary, desperate, human. Laura, he growled, his voice a broken rasp. Take Danny. Run. I took a step forward, tears blurring my vision. I can't leave you like this. His body trembled, the muscles beneath the fur convulsing as he fought the beast within. His eyes darted to Danny, who now stared back at his father, recognition dawning in his wide, tear-streaked eyes. Daddy, Danny whispered, his voice small and broken. The creature howled, a sound of pure anguish. Richard's eyes locked onto mine, pleading. End this, he choked out, please. My hand shook as I bent down, picking up Sam's gun. The cold metal felt like ice against my skin. My vision swam with tears, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Richard, the man, the father, the monster, looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with sorrow and love. Save him, he whispered. I closed my eyes, the weight of the moment crushing me. The gunshot echoed through the forest, a final, merciful release. When I opened my eyes, Richard's body lay still, his monstrous form slowly fading away, leaving behind the man he once was. Danny's sobs broke the silence. I pulled him close, my own tears falling freely. The night was still again, the forest holding its breath. We walked back to town in silence, the weight of what we'd lost pressing down on us. The monster was gone, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. Willow Creek would recover in time. The The whispers of the beast would become legends, stories told to keep children close to home after dark. But for Danny and me, the truth would always remain, a reminder of how easily the line between man and monster could be crossed, and that sometimes the only way to save someone is to set them free. The cold hit me like a punch to the gut the moment I stepped off the rickety bush plane. The wind clawed at my face, threading icy fingers through my beard, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. Black Hollow, my childhood home, lay sprawled beneath a sheet of snow, the building small and hunched against the endless expanse of frozen wilderness. The sky was slate gray, the sun barely a memory on the horizon. I hadn't set foot here in nearly 15 years, not since I left for the army, not since I left him. I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag, the familiar weight of it pressing into my shoulder. The pilot, a grizzled man whose name I hadn't caught, nodded once and climbed back into the cockpit. The engine sputtered to life, and within moments, I was alone on the icy landing strip, alone with my thoughts, alone with memories that wouldn't stay buried. The road to town was a narrow strip of hard-packed snow, bordered by dense forest. The trees seemed to close in as I walked, their branches hanging heavy, brittle under the frost. A deep silence filled the space between each footstep, the kind of silence that pressed on your eardrums, making you hyper-aware of your own breathing. My boots crunched through the snow, the sound sharp and too loud. As I rounded the bend, the first few houses of Black Hollow came into view. Smoke curled from chimneys, a reminder of warmth I didn't feel. The windows glowed with the soft light of kerosene lamps. But something was off. Curtains twitched as I passed. Faces peered out, eyes wary and quick to retreat. They knew who I was, or rather who my father was. The Rivera curse hung over me like a shadow. A tale whispered in the dark corners of this town. I remembered fragments of it from my childhood, cryptic warnings muttered by elders, kids who avoided me on the playground. But I'd always brushed it off as folklore, just another ghost story to keep children in line. Now their silence was heavy with suspicion, with fear that coiled like smoke. I kept my gaze down and pushed on, my chest tightening with each step. The house appeared at the end of the street, the way I remembered it. Old, sturdy, with dark wood worn gray by the elements. My father's truck, rusting and half buried in snow, sat in the driveway like a forgotten relic. The front door, once painted green, was now chipped and weather-beaten. I took a breath and climbed the steps, my fingers already numb as I fumbled with the key the sheriff had mailed me. The lock clicked, the sound startling in the stillness. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me. Wood smoke, old leather, and something metallic beneath it all. Something that made my stomach clench. The house was dim, the shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. My father's things were just as he'd left them. His boots sat by the door, caked in dried mud. A coat hung on the hook, its sleeves empty and accusing. The silence here was different from outside, heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. I dropped my bag by the door and moved deeper inside. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step stirring up memories I wasn't ready to face. The living room was cluttered with old newspapers, half-burnt logs in the hearth, and a recliner with the imprint of a man who no longer existed. I swallowed hard and turned toward the hallway. My father's bedroom door was closed. The thought of opening it made my palms sweat, but first I needed a drink. The kitchen was cold, the pipes groaning as I twisted the faucet. Rust-colored water sputtered out before running clear. I filled a glass, the water bitter on my tongue. As I set the glass down, I noticed it, a single set of wet footprints leading from the back door to the hallway. My stomach dropped. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The back door was closed, but a thin layer of frost rimmed the edges, the lock smeared with dampness. I hadn't come in through that door. I knew I hadn't. I followed the footprints, each step slow and deliberate. They were too large to be mine, the tread unfamiliar. They disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, stopping right in front of my father's bedroom door. I stared at the door handle, my breath shallow. The cold air pressed in on me, the silence broken only by the wind rattling the windows. I reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open slowly, revealing a room frozen in time. The bed was made, the blankets tucked in with military precision. The dresser was covered in dust, and in the middle of the floor, surrounded by melting snow, was a single piece of torn fabric, dark, coarse, and matted with hair. A low sound vibrated through the house, a sound that made my skin crawl and my gut twist. A howl, distant but unmistakable. It echoed through the walls, the vibration reaching into my bones. I knew that sound, and I knew it wasn't over. The howl faded into the distance, but its echo lingered inside me, a haunting reverberation I couldn't shake. I stood frozen, staring at the scrap of fabric on the floor. My hand shook as I picked it up, the damp fibers clinging to my fingers. Dark, coarse hair matted with bits of ice and blood. My father's blood? A stranger's? The questions pounded through my mind, each one heavier than the last. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and dropped the fabric. My eyes drifted back to the wet footprints. They led to the window. It was cracked open, just enough to let the cold creep in. The frost along the sill glistened like teeth. I crossed the room in 2 quick steps and slammed it shut. The latch clicked into place, but it brought no comfort. Whoever, whatever had been in here was gone. For now. The walls seemed to close in. The smell of damp fur, rust, and decay lingered in the air. I needed to get out, to breathe. My father's house, once a place of safety, now felt like a trap. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face. The twilight was deepening, the sky turning from gray to an indigo so dark it seemed to swallow the world. The forest loomed at the edge of the property, black shadows stretching like skeletal fingers. My breath came out in visible puffs, each one dissipating into the night. I forced myself to focus. The footprints in the snow outside matched the ones inside. They were spaced far apart, as if whoever made them had been running. I followed them, my boots crunching through the snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the hush of the evening. The tracks led me to the tree line, where they disappeared into the underbrush. I stared into the darkness, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not now. Something was wrong in Black Hollow. It had to do with my father, with the curse people whispered about, and maybe even with me. I took a step into the woods. The air changed immediately. The cold here was different, sharper, more alive. The silence was oppressive, a vacuum that swallowed sound. The wind whispered through the trees, but beneath it, I could hear something else. A low, rhythmic growl, faint but constant, like a heartbeat. I moved forward, the snow giving way to the frozen earth beneath the trees. My eyes adjusted to the dark, picking out shapes in the gloom, twisted branches, jagged rocks. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, fleeting and insubstantial. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, bathed in weak moonlight. The snow was disturbed, churned up as if something large had been thrashing around. Dark streaks marred the white surface, blood smeared in chaotic lines. In the center of the clearing, something gleamed. I approached slowly, my muscles tense, ready to flee or fight. The object in the snow resolved into shape, an old hunting knife, its blade stained crimson, its handle carved with familiar initials. My father's knife. My breath caught in my throat. He'd had this knife for as long as I could remember. He'd taught me to use it when I was just a boy, his hands steadying mine as we skinned rabbits or cleaned fish. Seeing it here, abandoned and soaked in blood, twisted my stomach into knots. I crouched down and picked it up. The metal was ice cold, the weight of it solid and real. A shiver crawled down my spine, not from the cold, but from the realization that something had hunted him. Or maybe he had hunted something else. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, knife in hand, my heart thundering. The forest was a wall of shadows, each one deeper and more menacing than the last. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for movement, for the source of the sound. There, a pair of eyes, low to the ground, gleamed back at me. Yellow, reflective, and too wide apart to belong to any normal animal. They blinked once, then twice, and I knew. Whatever was watching me wasn't a wolf. It was something worse. The eyes moved, slipping between the trees with a predator's grace. A low growl rolled through the darkness, vibrating through my bones. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, my muscles locked in place. The growl grew louder, more insistent. The creature stepped forward, just enough for the moonlight to kiss its form. My breath hitched. It stood on 2 legs, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Clawed hands hung at its sides, and its chest heaved with ragged breaths. But it was the face that sent a bolt of ice through my veins. Part human, part beast, a mouth full of fangs, eyes filled with pain, rage, and something else. Recognition. A cold whisper slithered through my mind, the malediction of the blood. Before I could react, the creature let out a roar that shook the air, and in that sound, I heard everything. Grief, fury, hunger, my father's voice, distorted and lost. I stumbled back, the knife shaking in my grip. Then the creature turned and melted back into the woods, vanishing as if it had never been there. I was left standing in the clearing, my father's knife clutched in my trembling hand, the howl still echoing in my mind. It wasn't over, it was just beginning. The wind picked up, slashing through the trees with an eerie howl. The clearing felt colder, emptier, now that the creature, my father, or whatever he'd become, had vanished back into the dark. My chest heaved, each breath like shards of glass slicing through my lungs. The knife in my hand felt small, useless against the weight of the truth bearing down on me. The stories were real. The curse was real, and it ran in my veins. I turned back toward the house, my legs weak, the ground shifting under my feet. Each step felt like wading through a nightmare, but I couldn't stop. I needed answers. I needed to understand why my father had become that, and why the same fate was clawing its way toward me. The path through the snow blurred, my mind spinning with fragmented memories. My father's distant eyes, the way he'd disappear for days at a time, the way he'd flinch when the moon was full. I stumbled into the yard, the house looming like a dark monolith against the night sky. The windows were still dark, but the door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I hadn't left it open. A cold dread pooled in my gut. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath me. The smell of damp fur and coppery blood hung heavy in the air. I closed the door behind me, sealing myself into the suffocating dark. The hallway stretched before me, shadows pooling in the corners. My father's bedroom door was still open, the footprints on the floor now smeared and fading. I hesitated, every muscle in my body screaming to turn and run, but I couldn't. Not yet. I crept forward, the knife tight in my grip. The hallway seemed to stretch, the walls closing in, suffocating me with the weight of decades of secrets. As I reached the threshold, a noise from within the room froze me in place, a soft, shuddering breath. I stepped inside. She was standing there, her back to me, framed by the moonlight pouring through the window. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her shoulders, and her clothes were torn, ragged. Her bare feet left dark stains on the wooden floor. She turned slowly, and when our eyes met, the breath left my lungs. "Mom," I whispered. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and streaked with dirt, but it was her eyes that struck me like a fist to the chest. Wild, desperate, filled with an agony that I recognized. Her lips curled back in a grimace, revealing elongated canines, her fingers tipped with claws that caught the glint of the moonlight. "I waited for you," she said, her voice raw and broken. "I waited for so long." My mind splintered under the weight of the realization. My mother hadn't abandoned us. She hadn't died. The curse had claimed her first, driving her into the wilderness, into a half-life of blood and shadows. She took a step closer, her movements predatory, her eyes flickering between human sorrow and animal hunger. "It's in you too, Tomas. I can feel it. The pull, the hunger." I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. "I don't want this." "Neither did I," she whispered. "But it's too late. The blood knows. It always knows." Her body trembled, her face contorting as the beast within her fought to break free. "You have to make a choice," she rasped. "Join me, or end it." The air thickened, my pulse pounding in my ears. My father's knife felt impossibly heavy in my hand. I could feel the heat of the curse simmering beneath my skin, the wildness clawing to get out. The moonlight through the window felt like a spotlight, exposing my raw, fragile humanity. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't let it take you like it took me." Her eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of my mother's love breaking through the monster's torment. I knew what she was asking, a mercy she'd never been granted. My fingers tightened around the knife. My heart shattered. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Her eyes closed and she nodded. I moved swiftly, the blade slicing through the cold air, through flesh and bone. Her body crumpled into my arms, a final shudder escaping her. The tension melted from her face, and for a moment, she looked peaceful, free. A sob tore from my throat as I lowered her to the floor. The curse ended with me. It had to. I couldn't let it pass to another generation, couldn't let it spread more pain, more death. I stumbled to the window, the night vast and merciless. The wind carried away my screams, my grief blending with the howls that had haunted me for days. When I finally left the house, the first light of dawn bled into the horizon, weak and cold. The forest was silent, the curse laid to rest. I walked away, leaving footprints that the snow would soon erase, knowing I was free, but forever marked. The blood always remembers. And so would I. I didn't expect the smell of pine to hit me so hard. The cold, crisp air filled my lungs as I stepped out of the rental car and onto the cracked pavement of Main Street. The sky above Redwood Falls was an endless stretch of gray clouds, heavy with the threat of snow. It felt like stepping back into a memory, one I'd buried deep, one that scratched at the edges of my mind like nails on glass. The town hadn't changed much. Storefronts with faded signs, street lamps casting long shadows in the dying light. People moved briskly, wrapped in coats and scarves, their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Even now, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept under my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter and glanced at the notebook in my hand. 3 teenagers missing in the last 6 months. The words felt cold and clinical, far removed from the reality of parents waiting by windows, praying for the sound of footsteps that never came. I knew that feeling all too well. I hadn't been back here since Sophie disappeared. The thought of my sister sent a sharp pain through my chest. I pushed it down, like I always did. This wasn't about her. This was about finding out what the hell was happening in this town. And maybe, just maybe, getting a sense of closure I'd been chasing for a decade. I started walking toward the sheriff's station, my boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that had settled over the sidewalk. The weight of my old life pressed down on me with every step. The memories of late-night whispers, of my parents' haunted eyes, of Sophie's laughter echoing through the trees. They all clung to me like shadows. The bell above the station door jingled as I pushed it open. The warmth inside was almost suffocating. A young deputy looked up from behind the front desk, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw me. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone wary. I pulled out my press badge. "Sarah Carter, I'm here to see Sheriff Grady." His jaw tightened. "He's busy." "Tell him it's about the disappearances," I said, matching his gaze, "and that I'm not leaving." He hesitated for a moment before disappearing into the back. I took the chance to scan the station. The walls were lined with faded photos of town events, smiling faces frozen in time. But there was a heaviness here, too, a silence that settled into the corners like dust. The door to the back office creaked open, and Sheriff William Grady emerged. His hair was thinner, his face more lined than I remembered, but his eyes held the same guarded suspicion. "Sarah," he said, his voice gravelly, "didn't think I'd see you again." "Didn't think I'd come back," I replied. He gestured to his office. "Let's talk." I followed him inside, the door clicking shut behind us. His office smelled of coffee and old paper. He sank into the chair behind his desk, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know why you're here," he said, "but you won't find what you're looking for." I leaned forward, my fingers tightening around my notebook. 3 kids, Grady. 3 kids gone without a trace. The same way Sophie disappeared. And you're telling me there's nothing to find? His jaw clenched. "Some things are better left alone." Anger flared in my chest. Not for the families who are still waiting, not for the kids who might be next. He sighed, the fight draining out of him. "You think you know this place, Sarah, but there are things you don't understand. Things you shouldn't understand." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "Then help me. Tell me what you know." His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I saw something there. Fear, maybe even guilt. But then the shutters came down. "I can't help you," he said. "Stay out of the woods, Sarah. That's the best advice I can give." I stood up, my heart pounding. "That's not good enough." I turned and walked out before he could say another word. The cold air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside. The sun had set, and the street lights flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows on the snow-covered ground. I looked toward the edge of town, where the trees loomed like sentinels in the darkness. The forest had always been there, watching, waiting. It had taken Sophie, and now it was taking others. I wasn't going to let it take anyone else. Sheriff Grady's warning echoed in my head, "Stay out of the woods." But I knew there was only one way to get the answers I needed. I had to go back into the place where my nightmares began, and I had to do it alone. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of darkness that seemed to swallow the weak glow of the streetlights behind me. My breath misted in the cold night air, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not when the truth, about the disappearances, about Sophie, was buried somewhere in those shadows. I pulled a flashlight from my bag, the beam cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The wind stirred the branches overhead, making the trees groan and creak like ancient bones. I stepped off the road and onto the forest trail, my boots sinking into the frost-covered earth. The silence here was different, heavier, more deliberate, as if the woods themselves were listening. The deeper I went, the more the town behind me faded. The sounds of civilization, Distant cars, the hum of street lamps, gave way to the muffled crunch of snow and the whisper of the wind weaving through the trees. The trail twisted and narrowed, and I forced myself to focus, scanning the ground for any sign of the missing teens. Broken branches, a scrap of cloth, anything. But the path was undisturbed, a pristine blanket of white stretching ahead. My mind wandered back to that night, 10 years ago. Sophie and I had dared each other to go into the forest. Typical teenage bravado. We were 17, inseparable, two halves of the same stubborn soul. I could still see her face lit by the flicker of our flashlight, her laughter echoing through the trees. Then she was gone. I shook the memory away, the ache in my chest growing tighter. I wasn't that scared teenager anymore. I was here for answers, and I wouldn't leave without them. The flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my palm, and the beam steadied. A noise stopped me cold, a low rustle, just off the trail. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the beam toward the sound, the light illuminating a tangle of underbrush. The leaves trembled as if something had just passed through. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the trees. No answer, just the wind. I forced my feet to move forward, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The trail curved, and suddenly the trees opened into a small clearing. My flashlight swept across the space, and my stomach dropped. Footprints, fresh, leading to the center of the clearing, where the snow was disturbed, churned up as if someone had struggled. I crouched down, my fingers brushing the edges of the prints. They were too small to be an adult's. One of the missing teens. The tracks stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had been lifted off the ground. A cold dread settled in my gut. Then I noticed something else, a dark stain seeping through the snow. Blood. My throat tightened, nausea rising. Whoever had been here didn't leave willingly. I stood up, my legs trembling. The flashlight's beam wavered as I scanned the trees, half expecting something to lunge from the shadows. The silence felt thicker now, suffocating. And then I heard it, a whisper of movement behind me. I spun around. Nothing. My breaths came shallow and fast. I was about to turn back when the beam of the flashlight caught something nailed to a tree. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. A strip of fabric, torn, dirty, stained with blood. My fingers went numb as I realized what it was. A piece of Sophie's jacket. The world tilted. My vision blurred with tears as I traced the frayed edges, the color faded but unmistakable. She had been here, not just the night she disappeared, but more recently. Someone, or something, had kept her close to this place. A sharp snap echoed through the clearing. I froze, the sound prickling my skin. The trees felt closer, the darkness pressing in. I turned, slowly, my heart hammering. The flashlight trembled in my grip. Eyes stared back at me from the shadows. Wide, reflective, inhuman. They blinked once, twice. Then the figure stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch it. My breath caught. It was a girl. Her hair hung in tangled clumps over her face, her clothes shredded and dirty. But there was something wrong with the way she moved. Her limbs stiff, her posture twisted. She lifted her head, and I saw her eyes clearly. They were yellow and filled with pain. "Sophie," I whispered. The girl let out a low, guttural growl, her lips peeling back to reveal sharp, elongated teeth. Her body shook as if she was fighting something within herself. A noise escaped her throat, half sob, half snarl. She took another step forward, and I saw her hands, fingers curled into claws, tipped with cracked, dirty nails. The remnants of my sister's face stared back at me, twisted by something monstrous, something ancient. Tears streamed down my cheeks. "Sophie, it's me, it's Sarah." Her body trembled violently. Her eyes flickered, a hint of recognition, a glimmer of the girl I knew. Then her jaw clenched, and a ragged, heart-wrenching sound tore from her throat. "Run!" she rasped. The word was barely human, and it was all the warning I got. She lunged. Her scream tore through the air as she lunged at me, a blur of claws and fury. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the icy ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, clattering somewhere into the dark. My world narrowed to the sound of her ragged breath, the glint of her yellow eyes, and the primal terror roaring in my veins. This can't be Sophie, but it was. Twisted and warped, her body caught between human and beast, my sister was still in there, drowning beneath the curse that held her captive. She landed inches from me, claws gouging deep into the frozen earth. Her chest heaved, and for a brief agonizing moment, her eyes met mine. I saw the horror there, the agony of being trapped in this monstrous form, the desperate plea for help. I couldn't let her become this forever.
Sophie!
I gasped, scrambling to my feet. My voice broke.
Please fight it! You have to fight it!
Her body convulsed, caught in an internal war. Her hands, claws, flexed and twitched, as if she was trying to pull herself back from the edge. A strangled cry escaped her, half human, half animal. I took a step forward, my hands outstretched. I know you're still in there. It's me, Sarah. I never stopped looking for you. Her face contorted, teeth bared in a grimace of pain. She shook her head violently, the tangled strands of her hair whipping around her face. Her eyes flickered. For a split second, they softened, the yellow bleeding back to the familiar green I remembered. My sister's eyes, my sister's soul. Then a deep voice echoed from behind me. Step away from her, Sarah. I spun around, my heart dropping like a stone. Sheriff Grady stood at the edge of the clearing, a rifle aimed at Sophie. His face was grim, shadowed by something deeper than just duty. Behind him, a handful of townsfolk stood with torches and weapons, people I'd known my entire life. Mr. Caldwell, my old teacher, Mrs. Henley from the grocery store, all of them staring at Sophie with a mix of terror and resignation. "No!" I shouted, moving to block their aim. "You don't understand. She's still in there. We can help her." Grady's eyes hardened. "We've tried helping Sarah, for years. This curse can't be broken. The only way to protect the town is to end it. She's not a monster." My voice cracked. "She's my sister." His jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the rifle. "I'm sorry, but she's not your sister anymore." A guttural growl rose from behind me. I turned to see Sophie's body trembling. Her eyes squeezed shut as if trying to block out the world. Her breathing was ragged, shallow. I could see the war inside her, the human fighting against the beast. I had to make a choice. A horrifying thought clenched my gut. Maybe Grady was right. Maybe there was no way to save her. But another part of me screamed in defiance. I hadn't come this far to lose her now. Not after everything. Not after 10 years of grief, guilt, and emptiness. I dropped to my knees in front of Sophie, tears freezing on my cheeks. "Sophie, listen to me. You don't have to do this. You don't have to fight alone." She opened her eyes, green again, barely holding back the yellow. Her lips quivered. "I can't," she choked out. "You can," I whispered. "We can do it together. Let me help you." Her claws dug into the frozen ground and a sob racked her body. "It hurts." "I know." My hands trembled as I reached for hers. The claws scraped my skin, but I didn't let go. "I'm here. I'll always be here." A deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. For a heartbeat, the forest seemed to hold its breath with us. The crowd behind me was silent, waiting for the monster to return, waiting for the worst. But then Sophie's form began to change. The claws retracted, her hands trembling in mine. Her breathing slowed, the wildness in her eyes fading like a nightmare dissipating with the dawn. Her face softened, the beast melting away to reveal my sister, gaunt and pale, but herself. I let out a shaky breath, my tears falling freely now. "Sophie." She collapsed into my arms, her body weak and cold. Her fingers clutched at my jacket, and for the first time in a decade, I felt whole. Behind me, I heard Grady lower his rifle. The townsfolk stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. No one spoke. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. "You found me. I never stopped," I said, my voice breaking. "I never will." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the scent of blood and fear. The forest felt different now, as if a shadow had finally lifted. Sophie was free, and maybe, just maybe, so was the town. I helped her to her feet, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. We turned toward the path, away from the clearing, away from the place that had held us captive for so long. Sheriff Grady stepped aside, his eyes softening with something that looked like regret. "Go," he said quietly. "Start over, both of you." We walked out of the forest together, the first hints of dawn stretching across the sky. The cold still bit at my skin, but it didn't matter. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't walking alone. The wind rattled the windows again, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed through the empty house. I sat in my worn armchair, staring into the fireplace where the flames barely fought back the cold. Shadows danced on the walls, long and distorted. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking another evening that felt exactly like the last. I didn't remember the last time the house felt warm. Or maybe I did, and it hurt too much to think about it. The rooms were empty now, stripped of laughter, of life. This old place was just a husk, like me. The mug of coffee in my hands had gone cold, but I hadn't noticed. My fingers curled tighter around the ceramic as I listened to the sounds outside, the whisper of leaves, the low hum of night settling over the fields, and something else, something just beneath it all, a sound that didn't quite belong. I closed my eyes and took a breath. The smell of damp earth and old wood filled my lungs. It reminded me of him, of Richard, coming in from a long day in the fields, his boots caked with mud, his face split by that crooked smile, and Daniel, trailing behind him with his little hands clutching a toy truck, his laughter a bright, piercing thing. A sharp ache bloomed in my chest. The memories had edges now, sharp enough to cut. I exhaled slowly, trying to push them back down to where they belonged. Gone. They're both gone. The wind rose again, howling through the gaps in the wooden frame of the house. I set the mug on the side table and rubbed my hands over my face. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window. A pale, hollow-eyed woman with lines carved deep into her skin. A stranger I barely recognized. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement beyond the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The yard was a stretch of shadows under the full moon, the fence barely visible in the distance, but something was out there. A shape, too large to be a coyote, too fluid to be human. It moved along the edge of the tree line, slipping between patches of darkness. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I leaned closer to the window, my fingers trembling against the glass. The shape paused just before the line of trees, its head turning slowly toward the house. Two eyes glowed back at me, faint but unmistakable, yellow, piercing, filled with something raw and wild. I stumbled back, the breath rushing from my lungs. My heart thundered in my ears, a frantic, irregular rhythm. No, not again. It can't be happening again. The memories surged, refusing to stay buried. Richard's twisted face, his eyes that same terrible yellow, his body convulsing as he became something I couldn't understand, something monstrous. And Daniel's scream, high and thin, swallowed by the night. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. The edges of the room blurred, shadows pressing in from all sides. I forced myself to breathe, in, out, in, out. When I looked back at the window, the shape was gone. The yard was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The unease that had settled into my bones wasn't the kind that faded with reassurance. It was the kind that knew, the kind that remembered. A knock at the front door made me jump. I swallowed hard, my pulse a relentless thrum. The knock came again, louder this time. I glanced at the clock on the mantel. Nearly midnight. Nobody visited this late. Nobody visited at all. I took a shaky step toward the door, the floorboards creaking underfoot. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitation, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Mrs. Parker?" a voice called, low, male, familiar. I exhaled slowly. "Sheriff Harris." I opened the door a crack, the cold air biting at my skin. Sheriff Mark Harris stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, his face set in lines of grim determination. His eyes flicked over me, assessing. "Evening, Evelyn," he said. "Sorry to bother you this late." I nodded, the muscles in my neck stiff. "What is it, Sheriff?" He cleared his throat, his gaze shifting toward the dark fields beyond the house. "We've had more trouble. 3 kids from town went missing tonight. Last seen near your property." A cold hand wrapped around my throat. The room tilted slightly. "Missing?" I echoed, my voice thin. His eyes met mine, something hard and wary behind them. "You seen anything unusual tonight?" I thought of the shape in the yard, the eyes, the way the shadows seemed to breathe. I shook my head slowly. "No." His jaw tightened. He didn't believe me. "We'll be searching the area. Just thought I'd check in with you first." I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I don't know anything, Sheriff." He studied me for a long moment, the silence stretching between us like barbed wire. Finally, he nodded and stepped back. "Let me know if you remember anything." I closed the door before he could say more, my hands trembling. The latch clicked into place, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I leaned against the door, my eyes drifting shut. The wind whispered outside, carrying secrets I'd buried deep. Secrets that were clawing their way back to the surface. It's happening again. And this time, there was nowhere left to run. The door felt solid against my back, but the illusion of safety was thin. My heart thudded painfully, a drumbeat of dread that refused to slow. Sheriff Harris's words rang in my ears. 3 kids, missing. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to steady my breathing. The cold from the doorknob seeped into my fingers, anchoring me in the present. My gaze drifted to the window, where the shadows outside seemed thicker, hungrier. That shape, those eyes, they weren't a figment of my imagination. They were real. And now more children were gone. I forced myself to move away from the door, each step like walking through wet sand. The floorboards creaked beneath me, a sound that used to be comforting but now felt ominous. The living room was dim, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. The cold was creeping back in, settling into the walls, the furniture, my bones. I needed to think, to remember. My feet carried me toward the mantel, where faded photographs stood guard over my memories. Richard's eyes, bright and carefree. Daniel's smile, missing a tooth. My fingers traced the edge of the picture frame, the glass cold beneath my touch. The memories came rushing back. The night Richard changed, his body contorting, bones snapping like dry twigs. The yellow eyes that replaced his warm brown ones. The savage, inhuman roar. I remembered grabbing the old hunting rifle, my hands slick with sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The sound of the shot, the way the recoil jolted through me, the silence that followed. And then, Daniel, his small body limp in my arms, the tears that wouldn't come, the numbness that set in like frostbite. I buried them both in the earth out back, convinced the nightmare was over. But nightmares don't die that easily. A chill rattled through me, and I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders. I turned away from the photographs, the past too heavy to bear tonight. My eyes flicked to the clock, 12:47 a.m. The house was too quiet, the silence broken only by the ticking of seconds slipping away. Think, Evelyn, focus. I needed answers. There had to be a reason this was happening again. Why now? Why them? A sudden sound outside shattered the stillness. A low dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. It was coming from the barn. A memory stabbed through my mind. Richard disappearing into that same barn days before the attack, muttering about something he'd found in the woods. He hadn't let me inside. The look in his eyes had been wild, desperate. I grabbed the lantern from the side table, my fingers trembling as I lit the wick. The flame flared, casting a weak, flickering light. My reflection in the glass was pale and hollow, eyes shadowed with fear. I didn't recognize her, this woman with lines etched deep into her face and secrets buried even deeper. But she was all I had. I opened the back door, the wind slapping me with icy fingers. The lantern's flame shuddered but held. The yard stretched out before me, a quilt of frost-covered grass and moonlit shadows. The barn stood like a dark sentinel against the night, its doors slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. Each step toward it felt like a descent into some forgotten underworld. My boots crunched on the frozen ground, the sound deafening in the hush. The dragging noise had stopped, replaced by an awful silence that coiled around my throat. I reached the barn doors and hesitated. The wood was cold under my hand, rough and splintering. My breath fogged in the air, wisps of fear escaping my lungs. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning like something alive. The lantern's light spilled into the darkness, revealing rows of rusted tools and bales of hay covered in dust. The scent of mold and old wood hung heavy in the air. I stepped inside, my eyes straining to see beyond the feeble glow. Then I saw them, tracks on the dirt floor. Large, deep impressions, more animal than human. Clawed toes had gouged the earth, leaving behind jagged lines. My stomach turned to ice. I followed the tracks deeper into the barn, the shadows pressing closer. My heartbeat was a frantic rhythm in my ears. The tracks led to the back wall where the hay was piled high. Something had been burrowing through it, creating a hollow space. A low growl rumbled through the darkness. I stumbled back, the lantern shaking in my grip. The growl deepened, vibrating through the air, through me. Two eyes opened in the shadows, yellow, gleaming, filled with a terrible recognition. I knew those eyes. My knees went weak. "No," I whispered, "it can't be." The figure shifted, stepping out of the shadows. The lantern's light revealed matted hair, torn clothing clinging to a frame that was too thin, too fragile. But the face, beneath the grime and the twisted features, it was there. The curve of the jaw, the shape of the nose. "Daniel?" My voice cracked. He tilted his head, the yellow eyes flickering. For a moment, just a moment, the wildness faded. His lips trembled, and a soft, broken sound escaped him. "Mama." The word shattered me. But then his body convulsed, the animal fighting to reclaim him. A snarl twisted his face, his fingers elongating into claws, his shoulders hunching as if the weight of the curse was crushing him. I took a step back, tears streaming down my face. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. He was my son, and he was a monster. The growl rose into a roar, and in that sound I heard everything: his pain, his anger, his confusion. It swallowed the boy I once knew, leaving only the creature behind. "Daniel," I sobbed, my voice breaking. "Please come back to me." He lunged. Time slowed as he lunged, his claws slicing the air between us. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs refused to obey. The lantern fell from my hand, shattering on the barn floor. The flame flared and died, leaving only darkness. In that instant, instinct finally took hold. I threw myself sideways, my shoulder slamming into a stack of hay bales. A rush of hot breath grazed my neck, followed by the sound of claws tearing into wood. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. My hand searched blindly for something, anything, to defend myself. A low growl vibrated through the barn, followed by the soft scrape of claws on dirt. My eyes strained against the dark, trying to track his movement. He was somewhere ahead, his form barely a shadow among shadows. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, earth, and something metallic: blood.
"Daniel,"
I whispered, my voice trembling.
"please, it's me. It's your mother."
For a moment, the growling stopped. Silence filled the space between us, stretched tight as a wire. I held my breath, my heart thudding in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft shuddering breath, almost a whimper. "Mama." The word was barely audible, wrapped in pain and confusion. My chest tightened, tears blurring my vision. He was still in there, trapped beneath the curse. My beautiful boy, my Daniel, the child I'd held in my arms, who once whispered secrets to me as we watched the stars. He was fighting, but the monster was winning. I took a slow, careful step forward. My hands trembled, my voice shaking. "I know you're hurting. I know you're scared, but you don't have to fight this alone." The shadows shifted. His eyes flickered in the dark, those terrible yellow orbs that glowed with a mix of fear and rage. His body trembled, caught between the child he was and the beast he'd become. I took another step. "Come back to me, Daniel. Please, we can fight this together." His breathing grew ragged, each inhale a struggle. For a brief second, the yellow in his eyes faded. Just a glimmer of the deep brown I remembered. My heart seized with hope. But then, his body convulsed, his face contorting in agony. He let out a scream, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something in between. The monster was clawing its way back, determined to bury what little remained of my son. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, searching for a way to stop this, to save him. But there was no cure for this curse, no magic that could erase what had been done. The only way to end his suffering was to do the unthinkable, to finish what I'd failed to do all those years ago. Tears streamed down my face, hot and bitter. My hands clenched into fists. "I'm so sorry," I choked out. "I'm so sorry." His eyes met mine, wide and pleading. For an instant, I saw the fear of a child who didn't understand what was happening to him. My heart shattered into pieces, each one jagged and raw. "I love you," I whispered. His body tensed, the growl rising in his throat. The monster was taking over. With shaking hands, I reached for the old pitchfork leaning against the wall. The wood was rough and splintered under my fingers. My vision blurred with tears as I gripped the handle, the weight of what I had to do pressing down on me like a mountain. He lunged again, faster this time, the snarl ripping from his throat. My body moved on pure instinct. The pitchfork drove forward, meeting flesh. A sickening thud echoed through the barn. He gasped, the sound sharp and broken. His eyes widened, the yellow fading to brown as he crumpled to the ground. The beast inside him receded, leaving behind only a boy, my boy. I dropped to my knees beside him, sobs racking my body. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. I cradled his head in my lap, brushing the hair from his face. His eyes fluttered open, soft and human again. "Mama," he whispered, his voice fragile. "I'm here," I said, my tears falling onto his pale skin. "I'm here, baby." His lips curled into the faintest smile. "It doesn't hurt anymore." I bent down and kissed his forehead, my heart shattering anew. "You're free now." His body relaxed, the tension slipping away. He let out one final breath, peaceful and still. The barn was silent. I rocked him in my arms, the darkness pressing around us. The monster was gone. The curse was broken. But the cost, the unbearable, heart-crushing cost, was almost more than I could bear. The dawn light crept through the cracks in the barn walls, casting everything in shades of gray and gold. I carried Daniel's body back to the farmhouse, each step heavy with grief. The world outside was waking up, unaware of what had been lost in the night. I buried him beside Richard, under the old oak tree where the roots ran deep and strong. The wind whispered through the branches, a soft lament that carried away my tears. As I stood by the grave, the weight of silence settled over me. The accusations of the townsfolk, the suspicion in Sheriff Harris's eyes, none of it mattered now. The truth was buried here, with my family. I turned back to the farmhouse, the place that held so many memories, so much pain. The wind stirred the fields, and for the first time in years, I felt a sliver of peace. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left would never fade.